question, why write this book? For those of you who don't know, Sharia was in Washington for 10 years. She knows I was never going to write a book about politics. I'm not going to write a book, not going to write a kiss and tell book, not going to divulge private conversations. I am fascinated by this art of persuasion and how to move people, how to get them to either change their position on something or at least see a position in a new light. The impetus behind the book actually did not come from politics. It came from Thanksgiving dinner and listening to various members of my family struggle to kind of prove what they believe and do it in a persuasive and compelling way. Mm-hmm. So I started thinking to myself, is it an acquirable, learnable skill, the ability to persuade? And you have to be persuasive in a courtroom. You have 12 jurors. They can have no real personal connection with you at all. So they're 12 strangers. Imagine that. Imagine you're standing in front of 12 strangers. It's a really important issue. Someone's liberty is at stake. Oftentimes there's a victim of the crime. You have to convince all 12. In politics, 7 out of 12 is fantastic. In a courtroom, it's got to be 12 out of 12. And you have to do it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest evidentiary burden. So that got me thinking, if it works in the courtroom, can it work outside the courtroom? The same things you go through in a courtroom. Who's my jury? What's my objective? What's my burden of proof? How good are my facts? How do I structure my facts? And then questions. How to employ questions, not to kind of put the other person on the spot, although there is a role for that, and there's a chapter on that, but how to use questions to persuade. How do you use questions to get the person that you're talking to see an issue in a new light, to better understand your issue, or in some instances to have second thoughts about what they believe. Most people who read this book will never find themselves standing in front of a jury, and they will never find themselves in Congress, but they will find themselves talking to a boss or a coworker or a family member or a neighbor, whether it's about a promotion or a new product, whether it's about a spiritual belief, whether it's about a cultural belief, how to be heard, how to effectively communicate. And then in this book, I hope I can teach you how to use questions, which is a counterintuitive way of proving your point. Most people are inclined to say, I think, I believe, I feel. Mm-hmm. I want to teach you that there is a role for that, for the affirmative, but there's also a role for kind of turning the tables and asking questions of the person with whom you're having the conversation. So that's why I did it. How to marry the courtroom with Congress. We've been a husband for 31 years, a father for 20-something years. I have 3 sisters. Got to constantly persuade them when I'm growing up not to, put me in dresses. And I've been on TV a lot lately, so they actually helped me with my makeup. That was actually good to have 3 sisters and learn how to put that on. But just how to live life in a persuasive way, being heard. That's why I did it.
Well, I think your experience as a prosecutor has certainly helped you to hone skills that are very remarkable and tremendous. And I'm sure a lot of the people tuning in today may know you from some of the time that you spent on the Hill questioning witnesses. But one of the questions I wanted to ask is, can you just share with us, and I think you talk about this some in your book, but just share with us how your experiences as a prosecutor helped you to develop those, what you called an acquirable, learnable skill of persuasion?
That's a great question. So I want you to kind of separate your mind into 2 categories. There are non-leading questions, who, what, when, where, how. And in a courtroom, you spend a lot of your time just getting someone else to share information. And we call those non-leading questions, and they almost always begin with one of those words: who, what, when, where, how. You can use that in real life because the other side is doing the talking. They kind of bear the burden of persuasion. You're just asking a question, and it's up to them to kind of prove whatever premise they're seeking to prove. And then we have what most people are more familiar with because it's on all the television shows and it's in all the movies, and that's cross-examination. That's what they're waiting on, which is a prosecutor cross-examining the defendant. And you don't ever ask who, what, when, where questions then. You ask leading questions where the answer is kind of implicit in it. Sometimes, and I have a chapter in the book on this, the question why is fraught with peril. And you have to be really strategic before you ever ask a question that begins why. You lose control. The why could last 2 hours. And who knows, they may have a plausible explanation for why they did what they did. So I never ask a defendant who is testifying why, unless the answer didn't matter. If the answer doesn't matter, then why can allow them to kind of hang themselves by trying to explain the inexplicable. Congress, you were there for a decade, Sharia, you know this. You get 5 minutes in Congress. And that's not enough time really to make one point. It's certainly not enough time to persuade someone beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom and picking which questions to ask. In the second part of this book, I go through the different categories of questions and what the purpose behind them is. And it is a learnable. I was terrible when I started. I hate to confess that to you, but you weren't even born when I started, so you wouldn't know that unless I told you. I was terrible when I started. So I'm not saying I'm great now, but I'm better than I was. It is an eminently learnable skill. You just have to think. I think when people read this book, they're going to say, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I never thought about it that way, but it makes perfect sense. The courtroom is where you learn to use questions in kind of a devilish way to prove your point.
When you said that you didn't want to admit, but you were terrible when you started, was it just a factor of being a prosecutor and wanting to ensure that you prosecute your cases well, or was there something intrinsic in you that wanted to develop this skill?
Well, thank you for going right back to that weakness I said I had. I should have known better than to have a lawyer do this Q&A portion with me. You obviously are a really good listener. You hear he's terrible at something. Let me go back and ask him about it. The reality is, Sharia, I've been asking questions of myself since I was a kid, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I didn't feel very smart when I was growing up, and part of that's because I didn't make great grades, but that's kind of how you judge whether or not you're smart, by what people tell you back. So I didn't think I was really smart, but I like to talk to smart people. My dad was a medical doctor. My best friend growing up wound up being an oral surgeon. So I'm around smart people. I got an option. I can talk and let them know how dumb I am, or I can ask questions. And then, I grew up in a faith-based family, and there are questions. You did too. There are questions that you ask about why certain things happen and the fairness of it. So I spend a lot of time, and still to this day, in what you call inner dialogue, I call talking to myself. If you can answer your own questions, that's the best preparation for whatever conversation you're about to have, is to have it within your own mind. Just don't do it out loud, or somebody's going to try to commit you to a psychiatric hospital.
So one of the things that I thought I enjoyed about the book was just how evident it was that you really love our judicial system and the judicial process. I thought some of the illustrations that you took from your experience as a prosecutor were just so relevant to kind of describe to the reader how that you could take those skills of persuasion via questions, but you can add it to your everyday life.
Yeah, and that's true on both sides. That's true when you're talking to victims, and it's especially true when you're doing what we call cross-examination. When you're in a courtroom and you have the victim of a robbery or any kind of crime, they're the star. You're not the star. They're the star. That's why you ask really short, simple questions, and they do all the talking. Cross-examination is completely different. You have to be the star of cross-examination, not the defendant, not the defendant's family member that's providing an alibi, not the expert witness. You also have to know how to get in and out quickly and make your point. You can't argue with experts on their, I tell the story in the book of a forensic psychiatrist that I was cross-examining. Well, I mean, forensic psychiatry, what does that tell you? That she's a medical doctor. So she's immediately smarter than I am in almost every realm, but certainly in her realm. So you have to have, what is your objective? So you have this really good witness on the stand. You certainly can't ask her about psychiatry. She's going to dance circles around you. So what is your purpose in whatever the next thing that comes out of your mouth is? What is your goal? You got a jury of 12 sitting over there. You have to be respectful and polite. They like the doctor. They may not agree with her, but they like her. So you have this innate sense that I need to be personable and agreeable, but I have to make my point. And where I see people struggle the most is they have no idea what their point is. There is no thought that has gone into how they sequence their questions. I'll give you an example from Congress too. I would have done the same thing in the courtroom. Jonathan Gruber was an MIT professor who was the author of the Affordable Care Act. So when you hear MIT, you know immediately he's smarter than Trey is. When you hear professor, you're reminded that he's smarter than Trey is. So I'm not about to ask him a question about economics. I'm just not going to. What I ask him about is what he said. And then people then want to explain, well, what I meant, we're going to get to what you meant in a minute. For now, let's just agree on what you said. And of course, you recall what he said was the American people are too stupid. So that's an example of when the why question would be appropriate, because there's no good answer for why did you call the American people stupid? And there's no good answer for what did you mean by stupid? There's just no good answer for that.
Right. And I think in the book around that same example, one of the things I appreciated about that example was how you talked about using repetition to begin to persuade, and just tell us a little bit more about how important repetition is when you are crafting your argument and persuading the listener.
Well, we are not wired to be repetitive. I mean, stop and think the number of times one of us have said to the other, stop if I've already told you this story. You never stop. I always stop. But we always preface it by saying, stop if I've told you this story, because we don't want to be perceived as repetitive. If you have a good fact, it takes 5 to 7 times for a fact to be firmly imprinted in the listener's mind. So when you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I've gone over this. I've asked the same witness the same question. What color was the stocking that the bank robber had on? I've already asked witnesses. I don't want to be repetitive. You have to be repetitive when you have good facts. So in the book, tragic fact pattern, husband kills his wife. He stabs her. And we're going to go through every one of those stab wounds. And it's painful and it's tedious. And you can look over and see that the jury doesn't enjoy it. But again, the more you engage in this art of persuasion, the more kind of an internal clock you have. It's one thing to not enjoy something, but know that it's necessary. I think the jury appreciated that it's necessary to go through these stab wounds. But by the time you get to the 7th, 8th, 9th stab wound, you've firmly imprinted in the jury's mind, this couldn't have been an accident. You don't accidentally do something 9 times. And then the question was, what did she say when you stabbed her? Well, what's a good answer to that question? I mean, if he says, well, she didn't say anything, is that plausible? That you're going to sit there and stab someone 9 times and they're just going to be okay with it and never say anything? If she said stop, that's helpful to you. Repetition, we're not wired to press our advantages. You played sports before, your husband played sports, you get up by 50 points, you start feeling sorry for the other side. Don't. press your advantage. And if you have a good fact, repeat it almost to the point where the jury just literally screams out, okay, we get it. We've heard you. Don't just say it once and think everybody's gotten it.
Now, taking some of these, the ideas you have in your book, using repetition. Another example you gave was preparation, prepare. And one of the questions I had for you is just, what are some of the tips that you would, or some of the things that you would tell the audience about how they can prepare in their everyday life? Obviously, if you're getting ready to have if you're getting ready to prepare for a jury trial, you're going to spend a lot of time getting ready for it, but you might have opportunities that just come and present themselves, or you might have opportunities that you're hoping for, like an opportunity to talk to your boss to persuade them to give you a raise or give you a job title change or things like that. How can you prepare for those instances?
Well, since you're my boss and you've already turned me down for a raise, I'm going to move to something even more important than money, which is college football. I know that I have to eat Thanksgiving dinner with my brother-in-law, whether I want to or not. I know that my mom is going to make me do that. And I know that college football is going to come up because he's a huge Clemson Tiger fan and he just can't stop talking. So if it's going to come up, I need to anticipate every way that it can come up. It can come up that they're the defending national champions. It can come up that they're going to win again, that they play the strongest schedule. And this has happened with my brother-in-law, who, on top of being a Clemson fan, is also a lawyer, so he's insufferable to talk to. And he married my baby sister, so it was like, that's like 12 strikes. What are your facts? Do you know not only your facts, but the facts on the other side? This is where that inner dialogue or having a conversation with yourself takes place. All right. I know what I'm going to say. What's his response going to be? One thing I don't see people do as often as I think they should is challenge fundamental factual assertions. Most of us are wired to kind of let the other person get started a little bit. If you and I were discussing something just out of kindness or manners, I would not want to challenge your first factual assertion. You would say something and I might be inclined to let that go. And my brother-in-law says Clemson plays the toughest schedule in the country. All right. I think he's headed somewhere else, but you got to stop him right there. I mean, what is the factual basis for believing that? That's your opinion. They actually have power rankings for schedules. So let's pull them up and see whether or not Clemson, in fact, plays the toughest. There's no doubt they were the national champions. There's no question about that. We're not fighting about that. You're telling me they're the national champion while also playing the toughest schedule in the country. That's a knowable fact. I spent more time as a prosecutor anticipating what the other side was going to say. I've got two children. As you know, Sharia, you and Javon have three. I've got two. I have never been successful at convincing one of those two to clean up her room. And that should give you a hint which one it is, since it's her room. So how do and I don't care, by the way, I hope my wife's not watching this. I don't care whether she cleans up her room or not, but my wife does. So my wife, who is the sweetest human being on the face of the earth, is not going to go talk to my daughter about cleaning up her room. She's going to send a lawyer to do that. I need to anticipate every reason Abigail's going to give me as to, number one, why it's not important. And that's where she starts. Why does it matter? That she's too busy with law school or watching Netflix or whatever she's doing, and she just doesn't have the time. Before I would have any conversation with a boss, with a spouse, I am going to want to anticipate every issue that comes up and what the other side's position on that issue is going to be. And if you want to be a world-class persuader, you have to know the other side of the argument every bit as well as you do your own.
How important are relationships, developing a relationship with someone? Even in the answer, your description, you're saying, if you had a relationship with one individual versus your brother-in-law, you might be more prone to go directly to, a question and ask your brother-in-law, but you might not ask another individual. How important are relationships in being able to persuade?
Well, because I believe persuasion is movement, even incremental movement, getting someone to either slightly alter their course or see an issue in a different way. Those examples of incredible transformations from one religious orthodoxy to another, from being a progressive to conservative or vice versa, those are rare. It just rarely happens in life that someone says they're going to vote for candidate A, and in 5 minutes you convince them to vote for a completely different candidate. It can happen, but it's rare. So you have to be prepared for the incrementalism of that. Relationships are essential if you're going to persuade. Not if you're going to argue, but if you're going to persuade. The challenge is, how do you establish that relationship even in a short period of time? And
Right.
there are ways to do it. I mean, you and I have known each other for 8 years. If we were to bump into someone that a new worker at the law firm or someone at your church that we had not met, you have to model authenticity and sincerity and credibility. And you do that best by listening and let the other person talk for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chapter in the book on faking sincerity. You cannot fake sincerity. I can't even believe I wrote that. But what I meant by that is, you don't feel it every day, but there are ways to model the characteristics of authenticity and sincerity. The chances of you walking up to, I don't know, when you were growing up, did anyone ever stop and knock on the front door and try to convert you to a different religion?
Yes.
Okay, it happened that's a tough sale. I mean, I admire anyone who gets on a bike and rides around the country and tries to convert you. I mean, that's a tough sell. Yeah. It's not as tough a sell the kids that stop by and ask me to buy Christmas wrapping paper. I don't use wrapping paper. I just use the Amazon box. That's all I do. But they want me to buy a magazine or wrapping paper. That's a much more doable thing. And the relationship doesn't have to last that long. But if there's no relationship at all, then it's tough to move people on major issues very far at all.
One of the things you just talked about was the difference between a debate and an argument. And you talk about that in the book as well, that arguments have their place and purpose, but a lot of times, that's what people go to. They just want to argue and say their thoughts or their feelings. But how important is it to be able to engage in a debate? And also, what is the mindset that you need to have before you enter into that debate?
Well, arguments are all about getting your say and kind of getting whatever it is off your chest. And persuasion to me is about movement. How to get the other person to see an issue in a new light or understand you better. And the more the anger or the emotion percolates to the top, just the less effective you're going to be. And I write in the book, part of knowing your objective before you start, do you want to build a fire, nurture a fire, or put out a fire? Do you want to infuriate or ingratiate? And you can't be in politics for as long as we were. Sometimes the purpose is just to have an argument. You just want to fight. But just understand that's not persuasion. And maybe you and I can write a book on how to argue later on. But arguing does not, what happens when you argue, particularly if it becomes ad hominem, is the other person becomes so entrenched that even if you were right, they'd never admit it. Persuasion is more fact-centric. It is this beautiful marriage of logic and passion. You can be passionate and still not argue. One of both of our dear friends was on television this week with, I thought, a very persuasive speech, and that was Senator Tim Scott. And he never raised his voice. You could sense the emotion, you could sense the passion, you could sense this logical progression he was going through, particularly as he was talking about his grandfather. He never raised his voice. So if your purpose is to argue, I am happy to loan you my daughter, and she can do that with you because she likes that. If your purpose is to persuade, I can loan her to you too because she's really good at that. You just have to know what your purpose is before you have that conversation.
You also talk about not only knowing what your purpose is and kind of what is your objective, but then also it's important for you to know your audience. Who are you talking to? How important is that to be able to persuade?
Well, if you don't know your audience, how will you ever measure success? And I know some people that are listening are thinking, well, of course, my jury, my audience is who I'm talking to. Usually, but not always. I mean, how many times have parents had a conversation with each other, but their real intended audience was the kid in the next room? I mean, I've had it a bunch. I don't know why she won't clean up her room. Well, it's very disrespectful. I don't know why she won't. I mean, you say it loud enough because that's your audience. The best example I can give you of that, well, I mean, sometimes in the courtroom, I mean, the judge will interact with the prosecutor sometimes in the courtroom. And you would think, well, the audience is the judge. That's who you're talking to. No, sometimes it's the jury. Sometimes you want the jury to know that you're reasonable and you're rational and you're fair. So they're going to be watching how you interact. In politics, particularly visiting African-American churches, Republican candidates in the past used to do that. They waited too late to do it. They would do it in October or November. But I asked a Democrat one time, talk to me about visiting African-American churches. And they said it's a 2-for-1. Number one is the audience you're talking to. Number two, it is women voters that want to know that you cared enough to try. Well, they're nowhere in that church that you're speaking, but that's part of who you're communicating to. So if you don't know who you are trying to persuade, then you will never be successful. And the jury, the audience, is not always. Imagine you're in a boardroom. I mean, you'll be on a board one day. You should be on the board of your alma mater right now, by the way. They should pick you to be on their board right now. But let's imagine you're on a board and you're having a conversation with the chairperson of that board. He or she may be your audience, or it may be your fellow board members that you're trying to persuade, even though that's not who you're talking to. If you don't know your objective and you know your jury with precision, you're not likely to be successful.
One of the things you mentioned earlier, and also that I enjoyed reading in the book, was the different types of questions. So it sounds, I really liked how you kind of walked through the process. It's not just walking into a room, seeing someone and deciding, let me have an argument with them to tell them why everything they believe is wrong and everything I believe is right. But it's really preparing in multiple ways, having that internal conversation, knowing who your audience is, and then knowing what kinds of questions and how to ask those questions. Tell us a little bit about how important it is to ask the right types of questions.
Well, man, I've got categories. I mean, there are questions designed to impeach or undercut what the other person is asserting. And you do have to be careful that those not be argumentative. But, part of persuasion is saying that you're closer to being right than the other side. And you can do that affirmatively, or you can expose the weaknesses with questions. Sometimes questions, I love to ask people to define their terms. I love it. You can have the biggest vocabulary in the world, and you will still struggle sometimes to define fully a word. Think about how often we've heard, just in the last couple of months, we've heard the word racist, we've heard fair, we've heard systemic, we've heard justice. What do those words mean? Because if we don't agree on the definition, then we're not going to be able to resolve whatever differences we have. I like to repackage what the person just said. So I just did it a little while ago. You asked me a very fair question, and I repackaged that. Why did you immediately go to one of my weaknesses? I have a bunch, so I'm not sure which one you went to. That's repackaging. That's not what you did. That's not what you meant. But I could probably convince somebody that that's how I took it. My two favorite rhetorical skills, I love to ask the question of why if it doesn't matter, because people struggle with that. I love to get them to define their terms. There's a section in the book that sounds morbid, but it's really not. Tim Scott and I were having dinner in Charlotte, and the topic of suicide came up. And that's a word we think we can all define. I mean, it's morbid to think about it, but we think we know what that means. And I asked him, there are people at this restaurant that were told to exercise more, and they are not. There are people at this restaurant that were asked to lower their cholesterol level, and they're not doing it. There are people at this restaurant that were told to take medicine, and they're not taking the medicine. What is that? If you are doing something consciously that may shorten your life, what is the word for that? Or does it have to happen in an instant? Most people would say, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, it has to happen in an instant. But says who? Says who? I love to make people define the words that they use. And you know that because you've been on the receiving end of some of those questions before in your life too.
Way too often. But it does help you think through not only, if you're making an argument, why, your side of the argument, but it helps you to think through all of the steps to get to that argument. So just talk, just like you said, your audience, why you believe something, what your objective is, and having that internal dialogue helps you clarify all of that information. Oh, go ahead.
I share one other little devilish trick that you won't ever use because you're too good of a person, but you're going to think about it. You'll think about it. Using questions to slow the other side down.
I do that all the time.
Well, but no, you're too good of a person. You do it because you really want to give them a chance to explain. I mean, doing it to absolutely shut down whatever they are trying to do, because I mean, the question has to be good enough to be somewhat relevant, but there is a cadence that people want to have when they're making their argument. And when you stop and ask for more information at every stage of that cadence, it is disquieting and disconcerting. I wouldn't do it with my spouse, but I might do it with somebody else. It's a magical way to get the other side to not be as effective as they want to be.
You have an example that I really enjoyed reading about in the book, and I think encourage our audience to read that example of using questions to slow down the person who's making the argument. I thought that was fascinating. I think my favorite chapter of the book was the chapter you called Hitchhiking. Tell us a little bit more about that one.
Hitchhiking is using someone else to kind of impeach the credibility or prove your point. So just think about hitchhiking, using someone else to get you where you want to go. The story I told in the Hitchhiking chapter was, and this is not a political book. I don't tell you what you ought to believe. I just try to help you communicate whatever it is you believe. But the stories have to come from what I did. So it's either the courtroom or it's Congress. So you think back July the 5th, Jim Comey has a press conference that's heard around the world because he's announcing whether or not they're going to be charging decisions as it relates to Secretary Clinton. And then Jason Chaffetz, the chairman of the Oversight Committee, decides we're going to bring Director Comey in. So you get 5 minutes. You get 5 minutes with a guy that spent, 12 months on an investigation. That's not enough time to get in to scienter or mens rea. It's not enough time to get into the elements of the statute. I mean, it's 5 minutes. That's all you got. So, I mean, I would encourage the folks that are with us today, how would you use your 5 minutes? What would your purpose be? Number one, who's your jury? Is it Comey? Is it your fellow members of Congress? Is it the staff that are all around the wall? Or is it people watching at home? Who's your jury? What is your purpose? What is your objective? And the objective that I settled on was to use Comey to impact someone else's credibility. So I asked him a series of questions. Every one of them had embedded something that Secretary Clinton had said. Every one of them. She said this. Was it true? And the answer to every one of them was no. So you have repetition, which is important. They're hearing no with the word true. And you are using someone else to get you where you want to go. Now, if I'd asked Secretary Clinton, she would have said, well, let me explain that. And so you lose the timing, you lose the symmetry of asking it. But by doing it through Comey, you get a series of no's, you get people questioning whether or not her information is reliable, and you don't have to do it through the person that is most interested in being perceived as truthful. It comes up some in life where you would use someone else. I mean, I can imagine the dinner table at Thanksgiving or Christmas, and you're trying to prove a point to this person by using someone at the other side of the table. It's powerful. It's rare. It's powerful if it's done correctly, primarily because the person you're impeaching is not able to defend herself or himself.
Well, some of the individuals that are watching today, we had questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn to those now and just ask you some of those questions. One of the first questions is from Murray out of Jupiter, Florida. Murray asks, as a prosecutor, do you have any advice for an aspiring prosecutor?
That it'll be the most meaningful job you ever have in your life. It's hard. You cannot unsee crime scene photos. You cannot unhear stories of grief and sorrow, the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse. It will have an impact on your soul, but I think I mentioned in the book, I call them kind of receiving line jobs, what you want people to come through and say to your spouse and children when you're gone. And the number one thing I want them to tell my wife is don't get remarried. But after that, I want them to say, your husband was a good prosecutor. It's the most meaningful job I've ever had. You know that. John Ratcliffe and I have been telling you that was the best job both of us have ever had. I think everybody, you work with Susan Brooks in Congress. I think every prosecutor you work with probably told you, Sharia, it was the best job we ever had.
Right. As another listener asked, what is your first thought as to advice to a young Secret Service agent regarding investigation?
To immediately have in your mind what the quantum of certitude you have to have is. Sometimes you investigate things to clear people. Sometimes you investigate to say, we did a good job, but we don't have enough. The frustration I used to have with law enforcement, and I love law enforcement, and I think people know that, the arrest is just the beginning of the story. That is not the end of the story. You can arrest someone based on probable cause. You cannot go in a courtroom with probable cause. So yes, we have enough to make an arrest. Is that your objective? Is your goal an arrest? That has never been my goal. My goal is a conviction if it's the right person. So whatever you can think of, not just to get that arrest warrant, but whatever you can anticipate the defense is going to ask, go ahead and do it. Nothing gets better in the justice system with time. Witness recollections don't get better. Crime scenes don't get better. Whatever can get you. I have a section in the book about, what does it take, to run a dog around a car? What does it take to search someone's home? What does it take to win in civil court? Sharia, you're familiar with that. It takes beyond a reasonable doubt to win in criminal court. And that should be your focus, not the arrest, but the conviction.
Darius from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, posed a question. What is something you know now that you wished you knew as a prosecutor?
What's something I know now that I wish I'd known as a prosecutor? I wish that I had done a better job of separating out the crimes that really needed me to press the gas pedal to the floor. We saw last night, Sharia, I don't know if you had a chance to see it or not, but Mr. Ponder got a second chance in life. He received a pardon. And a felony conviction is an incredible stigma to attach for someone to carry for the remainder of his or her life. It's just so debilitating. I'm not saying turn a blind eye. I'm not saying ignore crime. I'm saying that prosecutors have an enormous amount of discretion. And there are diversion programs, and there are ways that you can pay your debt to society without being saddled with a felony conviction for the rest of your life. When I was a drug prosecutor, I thought drugs were the most important thing in the world. When I was a firearms prosecutor, I thought firearms were the most important thing in the world. It took being a homicide prosecutor for me to realize that really is the most important thing in the world, is when you take somebody else's life. Or a sex assault case, which in the case of a woman is a life sentence if she's the victim. The proportionality, I wish I'd had a better sense of proportionality when I was a young prosecutor.
You talk a little bit in the book about some of your experiences as a young prosecutor and some of the advice that a judge who was dear to your heart gave to you about getting to know other people. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, my father was a doctor. I grew up, like you would expect a doctor's son to grow up. Although, I did have exposure to, non-doctor sons. That was just, that's how I grew up. And that's how you talk. But you're talking to normal people when you're talking to a jury or when you're talking to your coworkers. You may have a coworker that has a different life experience. So that judge told me, there are other places you can go. You don't have to go to a bar. I'm not saying you got to go to a bar, but that's what he told me. He said, look, I know you don't drink, but you got to go to a bar and start having conversations with real people, find out how they think, what they feel, what they believe, and why. That was the getting outside the confines of, we're all prisoners of our own experience, Sharia. You grew up a certain way. You make an effort to relate to people who grew up differently. I grew up a certain way. We have to be intentional about trying to understand how other people view life differently. And if you want to be persuasive, you do have to understand how they got to where they are. If someone is, completely anti-death penalty, I need to understand how they got there. Is it spiritual? Was it something that happened in their family? Is it an ethical belief? Is it an economic argument? You need to understand what makes people do what they do and believe what they believe, or you're shortchanging yourself as a persuader.
Another question. This question is a little more personal, but it's kind of funny. Stephen from Madison, Alabama, and I think you talked about this in your book. He says, "Did you really get your wife a leaf blower for her birthday?"
I did not, but Sharia, my wife, and she would be. Her last words to me were, "Don't get me anything for my birthday."
Yeah.
I have a weird philosophy that if there's somebody I care about that wants something, I get it for them then. I do not wait for their birthday or their anniversary. I did not get her a leaf blower. My wife doesn't know we have a leaf blower. She doesn't know we have a weed eater. She doesn't know we have a lawnmower. She works really, really hard. And I'm not saying she wouldn't cut the grass if I asked her, but I'm not going to ask her to do any yard work. She's a school teacher. She works really, really hard. She's not even big enough to start the weed eater. I'd have to get her an electric weed eater or a leaf blower because she can't pull the cord.
All right, I have two more questions for you from the audience. One is from Chuck, Colorado Springs, Colorado. He asks, what question tells you the most about a person?
If I get one question? So you're saying I get one question. I've just met Sharia Clark and I get one question?
Yes.
I would say, Sharia, tell me what's important to you. Because I can tell by what you say and how you say it. I used to do that. Tim Scott and I taught a class together. We were trying to figure out whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And Tim asked me, you get one question. And I said, it would be, what is your view of the nature of man? Do you think he's inherently good or inherently bad? And I can pretty much predict based on that answer whether you're a conservative or progressive. If I just met you and I just get one question, I can't ask where you went to school. I can't ask how you grew up. I would say, Sharia, what is important to you? And if it's you, I would hear faith, family, integrity. That tells me a lot.
Last question for you from Mary Beth out of Smithville, New Jersey. Smithville is in New Jersey. She asked, what is your definition of American exceptionalism?
I would paint a picture for you. I want you to imagine the beaches of Normandy and other people's sons landing there, not our country, somebody else's, and serving and sacrificing, not to free ourselves, but to free other people. We're protected by two oceans, to free other people who don't always have great memories about how they got freed. And the only thing we asked for was just enough room to bury them. That to me is American exceptionalism. That we're going to do this, and all we ask, you give us enough ground that we can bury our sons that liberated your country. That's how I would answer.
That's amazing. Well, Trey, I just want to thank you for joining me in this conversation, for sharing, so much of your experience and wisdom about the art of persuasion in your book. And I just wanted to see if there's anything else you'd like to add or share with the audience before we get ready to close.
Well, I want to thank them for giving you and I a chance to talk about this book. It is, again, not a book about what I believe. It's a book about how they can communicate what they believe. And I want to thank you, Sharia. You've heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. The most persuasive thing to me in all of life is not a great argument. It is an authentically lived life. And you have done that. And you have a phenomenal future as a television host, if that's what you want to do. I think you like law, but if you do this, but thank you for being willing, number one, to read the book. I'm not even sure everybody in my own family's done it just yet. So thank you for reading it, and thank you for asking such great questions about it, and for your time, because I know that you are a busy, busy lawyer. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. That's Trey Gowdy and his new book, Doesn't Hurt to Ask.